No coup. No shots fired, just the bang of a gavel. And the president is out of control. Judges replace him. This is the political reality playing out behind closed doors in courtrooms across America. In just 3 months, 11 executive orders signed by President Trump have been frozen one by district judges. No voters ever elected. The orders range from border enforcement to energy reform. All of them blocked not by Congress, not by the Supreme Court, but by district judges invoking the power of a legal tool. Few Americans understand the omnibus injunction that night inside a dimly lit office on Capitol Hill. Representative Byron Donald sat motionless, lit only by the pale blue glow of a laptop screen. The building had gone quiet for the night, staff long gone hallways still. But in this room, the silence wasn't peace. It was pressure on screen. A spreadsheet loaded from the Office of Management and Budget flickered with red highlights. 11 executive orders nullified injunction status. Active Donalds leaned in his eyes, scanning row border security tax relief for working families' energy permits all struck down. Not by debate, not by public protest, but by orders filed from regional carouses. One in California, one in Oregon, one in the D.C. Circuit, different names. Same result, his jaw-clenched fingers, tapped once on the table, then stopped. He didn't speak. Not yet. Instead, he closed the laptop slowly as if bracing for the weight of what came next. Then he reached for the phone and dialed Josh. He said flatly, "We're not in a constitutional republic anymore. Not if one unelected judge can overrule the will of 60 million voters." The silence on the line was short. "Send me everything." Senator Hawley replied, "We start tomorrow." Across the hall, lights were still on in Representative Jaime Raskin's office. The mood was different, tense but sharper. Almost rehearsed, a young aide stepped in quickly, phone in hand. "Sir, Judiciary just issued notice. They're calling a hearing, Justice. Jackson's been summoned." Raskin didn't flinch. He sat back in his chair, interlaced his fingers, and looked toward the window as if he'd already anticipated this move. A second later, Ayanna Presley entered, eyes blazing. "They want to fight." She said, "Fine, but they're not getting a confession. They're getting resistance," Raskin nodded. "Once they want headlines, we give them a constitutional lecture instead within the hour." He appeared live on MSNBC. His tie was loose, but his tone was precise. "Let's be clear, this is not about oversight. This is about intimidation of a black woman on the bench who dared to check executive power, and we won't be silent." Back in his office, Donalds hadn't moved. Papers were now stacked neatly in folders, but one remained on his desk. A single-page printout listing each executive order blocked by name, date, and court. He stared at it, not with confusion, not with fear, but with the stillness of a man counting down. Then, almost to himself, he said, "Tomorrow morning they answered to the people, no cameras, no audience, just a voice in the dark, and a country waiting for someone to speak first." And so it was a sleepless night for America. The Capitol woke before sunrise. Security teams moved faster, doors swung open wider. Inside the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, cameras rolled silently as staffers adjusted nameplates. Byron Donalds walked in, first eyes focused forward, followed closely by Senator Josh Hawley. No greetings, no small talk. They weren't here to discuss. They were here to clarify when Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson entered the room. Every seat was taken. Her robe had been replaced by a formal navy jacket, but her posture remained the same, calm, square. Composed, she sat at the witness table facing a semicircle of senators with Jaime Raskin to her right and Ayanna Presley sitting directly behind her. Their presence was not ceremonial but strategic. They weren't here to simply support. They were here to fight. Chairman Hawley banged his gavel in the session with a single deliberate tap. "This hearing will proceed as scheduled," he announced. "We are here to examine the growing use of federal court orders, tools never granted by the Constitution, but now used to paralyze the executive branch of government." He did not speak. He did not need to. The charges were fierce. Jaime Raskin leaned forward. "Before we get to this spectacle," he said, "let the record reflect what is really going on here. The conservative majority is using this committee to attack the very branch of government that dared to say no to their president." Ayanna Presley did not wait for permission. "This is not oversight, this is retribution. And Judge Jackson's presence here today is nothing less than targeted harassment." Donalds rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with one hand, and looked directly at Jackson. "No one here is intimidated by your presence," when he said, "but many Americans are concerned about your power." His tone was even but firm. They voted their president, signed the policy into law, and within days your rulings blocked it. Nationwide, so today we ask, how can a judge overturn the results of an election justice? Jackson looked him straight in the eye without blinking. Speaker, the judiciary does not overturn elections. It interprets the Constitution. When a policy conflicts with the Constitution, the courts have a duty to act that is not activism. That is structure. Donald's was unfazed. Then explain to the American people why since January, the president has not been able to issue a major executive order without first being vetoed by you. Jackson straightened slightly as if bracing himself not out of fear but out of principle, because some of the orders have attempted to bypass constitutional safeguards, and because convenience is no excuse for illegality. The room tensed. A few reporters moved forward. Holly looked up but said nothing. Raskin opened his mouth, then closed it. The message had been delivered, but the room had not yet absorbed it. Donalds lowered his voice. So today we are not just questioning precedent, we are questioning process, and we are going to find out whether that process still belongs to the people across the table. Justice Jackson's expression did not change, but behind her, Ayanna Presley's hands tightened on her thighs. For once there was no immediate rebuttal. The chairman gave a brief nod, allowing Representative Donalds to continue. He didn't return to his seat. Instead, he walked to the center podium and lifted a document folder onto the table behind him. A large monitor powered on silent white screen, turning to black, then rows of data flickering into view. 11 executive orders. Donalds began all issued within the first 90 days of this administration, all challenged and all blocked by universal injunctions. From district judges, he clicked the remote. Each order appeared in sequence: border security, asylum reform, domestic energy permits, tax holidays for working-class families. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. These weren't radical ideas. These were policies passed through the constitutional process, drafted, reviewed, signed, announced, and yet none of them reached implementation. Not because Congress rejected them, not because the Supreme Court struck them down, but because one judge in one jurisdiction said stop, and the entire country obeyed across the room. Raskin scribbled something onto a notepad. Jackson didn't move. Donalds looked up. Some of these rulings were issued within 48 hours of signature. No hearings, no damages established. No identifiable plaintiff was standing, just the court on its own applying national paralysis. He turned to face Justice Jackson. Directly, Madam Justice, explained to the American people how one federal judge, any federal judge, can stop an entire nation's executive policy without a single elected voice involved. Justice. Jackson responded with precision, her voice steady when an executive order has the potential to violate constitutional rights on a broad scale. It is within the court's authority to prevent irreparable harm. Waiting for individual injury is not always an option. Preventing damage before it occurs is a legitimate judicial function. Donalds countered without pause. Then where's the line? At what point does judicial caution become judicial veto? If one person can cancel the actions of a president, what's left of an election? Jackson held firm. No election grants permission to violate constitutional principles. That is the boundary. The court doesn't erase elections, it reinforces their limits from behind. Ayanna Presley added sharply. And the only thing more dangerous than judicial review is an executive branch with no brakes. Donalds turned toward her, calm but unyielding. And the only thing more dangerous than unchecked power is unelected power with no accountability. The room stirred again. A few murmurs passed behind the press row. Josh Hawley glanced down, tapping his pen slowly against the desk. Let me be clear. Donald continued, this is not about your identity, your career, or your nomination. This is about a legal instrument that now operates as a weapon, not a remedy. It's about universal injunctions used not to protect, but to override. Jackson folded her hands together. Representative, this court, any court, does not exist to enable or obstruct an agenda. It exists to uphold the law. And when the law is clear, the ruling follows. Donalds paused. Then why does it always follow one direction? No answer came, just silence. Senator Tom Cotton leaned forward, cleared his throat, and asked to be recognized. Hawley nodded. Cotton didn't raise his voice, he didn't posture. He simply began. We survived nearly 2 centuries without universal injunctions. That's not speculation, that's legal record. From the founding era to the mid-20th century, federal courts were limited in scope. Remedies applied to plaintiffs. Not the nation, he paused, letting the history settle into the room. And yet since 2007, we've seen an explosion. A tool once considered rare, extraordinary is now routine. It has become a switch to shut down national policy with a single stroke of the bench. Cotton opened a binder quoting case after case. Frothingham buries Mellon National Treasury employees. Union Summers 6, Earth Island Institute. In each of the he said, the court emphasized standing individual harm, judicial restraint. Now we see sweeping decisions based on abstract projections and ideological pressure. Justice Jackson responded. Calmly, Senator, legal tools evolve, the Constitution is enduring, but its application must respond to modern threats. When a policy is likely to cause broad constitutional harm, a broad remedy may be necessary. Cotton nodded once, and who decides what's likely? One Judge Jackson returned his gaze, the same branch that ruled against segregation, the same one that upheld Miranda rights when justice requires urgency. The courts must act. Donalds jumped in. Then let's call it what it is. We've created a new kind of veto, one that doesn't require votes, doesn't require compromise, doesn't answer to the people. Ayanna Presley leaned toward her mic. When the people are the ones being harmed, they don't need a vote. They need a voice. That's what the courts give them. Cotton turned to her eyes. Steady, the courts do not exist to speak for the people. The people speak through elections. What you're describing is substitution, not protection. Presley fired back. The courts step in when elections produce oppression. We've seen it before, and we won't wait for it to happen again. Holly looked up with respect. Congress was elected, the president was elected, but no one in this room can name the judge who halted immigration reform in week 2, or the one who blocked energy policy by Friday. That's the problem. Jackson's tone sharpened. No judge rules in secret. Their decisions are public, subject to appeal, subject to scrutiny. This isn't tyranny, it's transparency. Donalds closed his folder. It's unchecked, and what's unchecked always expands. History tells us that too. Cotton ended with one final point: when one unelected official can silence an entire administration. What's left of representative government? There was no immediate answer, just the quiet hum of cameras still rolling. Senator Tom Cotton leaned forward, cleared his throat, and asked to be recognized. Holly nodded. Cotton didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He simply began. We survived nearly 2 centuries without universal injunctions. That's not speculation. That's legal record. From the founding era to the mid-20th century, federal courts were limited in scope. Remedies applied to plaintiffs. Not the nation, he paused, letting the history settle into the room. And yet since 2007, we've seen an explosion. A tool once considered rare, extraordinary is now routine. It has become a switch to shut down national policy with a single stroke of the bench. Cotton opened a binder quoting case after case. Frothingham vs. Mellon. National Treasury Employees Union Summers v. Earth Island Institute. In each of these, he said, the court emphasized standing individual harm, judicial restraint. Now we see sweeping decisions based on abstract projections and ideological pressure. Justice Jackson responded. Calmly, Senator, legal tools evolve, the Constitution is enduring, but its application must respond to modern threats when a policy is likely to cause broad constitutional harm. A broad remedy may be necessary. Cotton nodded once, and who decides what's likely? One Judge Jackson returned his gaze, the same branch that ruled against segregation, the same one that upheld Miranda rights when justice requires urgency. The courts must act. Donalds jumped in. Then let's call it what it is. We've created a new kind of veto, one that doesn't require votes, doesn't require compromise, doesn't answer to the people. Ayanna Presley leaned toward her mic. When the people are the ones being harmed, they don't need a vote. They need a voice. That's what the courts give them. Cotton turned to her eyes. Steady, the courts do not exist to speak for the people. The people speak through elections. What you're describing is substitution, not protection. Presley fired back. The courts step in when elections produce oppression. We've seen it before, and we won't wait for it to happen again. Holly looked up with respect. Congress was elected, the president was elected, but no one in this room can name the judge who halted immigration reform in week 2, or the one who blocked energy policy by Friday. That's the problem. Jackson's tone sharpened. No judge rules in secret. Their decisions are public, subject to appeal, subject to scrutiny. This isn't tyranny, it's transparency. Donald closed his folder. It's unchecked, and what's unchecked always expands. History tells us that too. Cotton ended with one final point when one unelected official can silence an entire administration. What's left of representative government? There was no immediate answer. Just the quiet hum of cameras still rolling the atmosphere in the room, changed not louder but heavier. Donald's voice dropped, but his pace quickened. Justice Jackson. I want to reiterate what you said earlier. You said, that blanket injunctions are effective in preventing harm before it happens, but don't they also serve another purpose? A much more strategic purpose. Jackson cocked his head. Make your point, Representative. He nodded gladly when the district court froze. Federal policy with a nationwide injunction. The executive branch had no choice but to respond immediately. They were forced to appeal, they were forced to escalate. You turn temporary barriers into pressure valves. Tools to fast-track your ideology straight to the highest court. Jackson didn't hesitate. It's not strategy, it's structure. If the government believes a ruling is flawed, they can appeal. But in the meantime, the injunction protects rights that may be irreparably harmed. Donald stepped forward, but you don't wait for the record to be established. You don't wait for injury. You strike first, say likely harm, and then leave the burden on the government to fight back and respond. That's not judicial restraint, that's judicial leverage. Raskin interjected sharply. What you call leverage, I call accountability. We don't wait for a patient to bleed out before we provide care. Tom Cotton turned around blunt. This isn't trauma care, Congressman. This is constitutional governance. Jackson interrupted, her voice calm but sharp. The Constitution does not require us to stand idly by while our rights are threatened. The courts are not bystanders. Donald spoke for the first time, not loudly but clearly number. But they are not activists in black robes with national megaphones either. Ayanna Presley leaned forward. You want the judiciary to be silent while laws are written to harm vulnerable communities. That silence is not neutrality. It is complicity. Donalds looked her straight in the eye, and I want the judiciary to remember that its job is to interpret, not to govern the tension. Froze the room, even the reporter stopped typing. Then Jackson broke the silence. What I did, what this court did, was act when the moment called for it. We do not initiate conflict, we respond to crisis. Donalds nodded slowly as if accepting the premise, only to interrupt it. But the moment only comes when you define it. You decide what qualifies you. Decide what escalates, and you decide who has to respond. That's not emergency response. That's control. Jackson's lips tightened, but she held her ground. I don't decide the crisis, the Constitution does. Donalds replied softly but firmly. So why does every crisis happen to be about ideology? No one spoke. Not Holly. Not Racine. Not Presley. The silence wasn't confusion, it was recognition. He walked back to the lectern, paused, then turned toward the screen again. Let's leave theory behind, he said. Let's look at what's actually happened. The monitor lit up once more, this time displaying a simple graphic 2 columns left voter mandate. Right judicial injunction, line by line. Policy after policy matched a counteraction. Border enforcement, blocked energy expansion, blocked tax deferral blocked. He raised his hand toward the display. This isn't academic. This is operational. This is what happens when the people vote for action and unelected judges vote for inaction. Then he turned back to Jackson, so I'll ask again. And this time, I want a straight answer with this much authority. Centralized in district courts, where is the value of a presidential election justice? Jackson adjusted her microphone slightly. Her tone measured. The election gives the president power, but it doesn't give him immunity. If his actions conflict with the Constitution, the courts must intervene. That's not a razor, that's accountability. Donalds nodded slowly. Then who holds you accountable? Jackson's posture stiffened. Our decisions are published, appealable, reviewable, that is our check. Tom Cotton interjected, flipping through a legal report, and yet more than 70% of the injunctions cited here were issued before any material harm was demonstrated, before standing was fully established, preemptive blocks based on projected outcomes, not existing facts. Ayanna Presley responded quickly, we don't wait for rights to be violated to protect them. That's the whole point of a safeguard. Donalds leaned in again, and what you call safeguards, others would call override, because what you're describing is the ability to stop an entire government in motion, based on what you believe might happen. Raskin jumped in. That's called risk assessment, and it's a valid part of jurisprudence, but it's not a license. Cotton said firmly, and it's not democratic. The room pulsed with a controlled intensity. Holly didn't speak, but his stare remained locked on Jackson, reading every shift in her expression. Justice Jackson looked down briefly, then back up the judiciary. Doesn't seek power, it absorbs it. When others overreach. Donald stepped back toward his seat, but didn't sit. That's the most dangerous kind of power, the kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that claims to react, but always seems to lead. He let the silence linger, then closed with the line that would define the hour. If the courts can stop an entire country based on a hypothetical threat, then why hold elections at all? The silence from Donald's final question hadn't faded before Chairman Hawley leaned forward, elbows on the desk. Fingers locked. His voice came in low, deliberate tones. Justice Jackson, I'd like to return to fundamentals you've defended universal injunctions as necessary, as responsible, as constitutional. So help me understand. Understand precisely where in the Constitution is that power written. No pause, no rustle. The room froze with the weight of the question. Jackson inhaled softly. Her voice remained composed. The Constitution grants the judiciary the power to adjudicate cases and controversies. That authority includes the capacity to issue remedies sufficient to address the scope of harm. Holly nodded slowly as if inviting her to continue, then leaned closer. I didn't ask about interpretation. I asked about text article section. Where does it say that one district judge may issue an order binding the entire federal government nationwide? She didn't flinch. The Constitution does not list every specific remedy. Judicial precedent has long recognized the need for equitable relief when appropriate. Tom Cotton interjected flatly, and now equitable relief has become a tool for policy control. Ayanna Pressley shot back that tool has protected millions from unconstitutional bans, from racial targeting, from executive overreach. Holly stayed focused. Justice Jackson. In 2023, you gave a lecture at Columbia Law, you said, and I quote, "Universal injunctions can prevent national chaos by freezing dangerous policies before they spread." That's not judicial modesty, that's policy arbitration. Jackson responded firmly, that quote reflects urgency, not ambition. When policies risk national upheaval, the courts have a duty to pause implementation so the issue can be properly reviewed. Donald's cut in, so you stop the entire government so you can schedule a court date. Jackson turned to him. We prevent irreparable harm. While review takes place, that's not obstruction, that's protection. Cotton stood. But who protects the voters from a judiciary that sees harm in every election result? It disagrees with Jaime Raskin. Fired back elections, grant authority, they don't erase constitutional limits. The voters chose a president, not a monarch. Holly raised a hand, quieting the room. Then once again he turned to Jackson. You say the court responds to crisis, but you define what is a crisis. You decide when it starts. You decide who must stop, and you act before a single injury occurs. Jackson sat straight. Chin high because waiting for harm to unfold can make judicial review meaningless, delayed. Justice is denied justice. Donald shook his head. Delayed policy, delayed mandate, delayed executive function, all because one judge believes they see the future. Presley pushed back. When the future looks like suffering, we don't wait for blood on the floor. Holly leaned forward, voice crisp, and who determines what counts as suffering? What's legal harm and what's political disagreement in this new judicial model? Where exactly is that line, Justice? Jackson didn't answer immediately for the first time. Her fingers tapped lightly on the table. Not in anxiety, but calculation. The answer, when it came, was short. The line moves where the Constitution demands it. Holly didn't blink. Then who drew the Constitution, judges or the people? Another silence, this one colder than the last. Byron Donalds didn't let the silence linger. He reached for a new folder, thicker than the last. Unsealed it deliberately and held up a single-page document. The room adjusted. Body postures shifted. Even Racine sat forward, this Donald said. Isn't from a court, it's not from the Constitution. It's from a training packet distributed by an organization called Progress for Democracy. He walked to the screen. The document appeared behind him, projected in black and white strategic litigation guide, leveraging injunction power for national impact. Donald's voice stayed calm, But his words cut this memo obtained through a subpoena request. Outlines how progressive legal teams were trained to seek universal injunctions as a method to delay, disrupt, and derail conservative federal policy. It was distributed to law students, legal clinics, and partner NOS starting in 2021. He turned to the witness table. Justice Jackson, you're not responsible for this document, but I'd like to ask, do you believe your courtroom has been used to advance the strategies in this playbook? Jackson didn't look at the screen. She looked straight at Donald's representative. I don't preside based on advocacy memos. I rule on arguments brought before me. I'm not accountable for how outside groups interpret or exploit judicial precedent. He stepped closer, but you've written opinions that this memo cites directly. Do you understand how your decisions are being used as part of a broader political campaign? Raskin cut. And let's be clear, what you're holding is not a scandal. It's activism, and in America, activism is legal? Tom, Cotton countered, immediately weaponizing the courts to achieve legislative goals that failed. In Congress is not activism. It's subversion of process. Ayanna Pressley pushed back. You're calling civil rights? Litigation subversion? These are tools used by generations of Americans denied access to power. Donald shook his head. The civil rights movement wasn't about stopping a sitting president from enacting legal policy. It was about expanding access to democracy. This is about reversing elections through injunctions. Jackson leaned into her mic. Her voice had the sharpness of someone tired of being cornered. I do not and will not answer for the intentions of those who cite my rulings. My job is to interpret law. If others exploit that, it's on them, not on the court. Holly spoke, now calm but deliberate, except when that exploitation leads to a judicial system viewed not as neutral, but as partisan. And when the public sees courts as extensions of advocacy, networks' trust collapses. Jackson responded evenly. What collapses public trust is political hearings aimed at discrediting judicial independence. Donald's closed the folder. What collapses public trust is watching one ideology lose at the ballot box, then win in the courtroom before a single law is implemented. The room tightened again. This wasn't a legal debate anymore. This was a referendum on the legitimacy of the courts themselves, and no ruling could reverse what had already begun. Senator Hawley leaned forward. His tone was quieter now, but colder. This is no longer a theoretical debate. It's time for legislative remedy. He raised a folder and opened it slowly. I submit the Restore Executive Power Act for public record and immediate committee review. A new document appeared on the screen. 5 pages single-spaced. The core provision was simple: district courts would no longer be allowed to issue injunctions that extend beyond the parties involved. Nationwide blocks would be banned. He looked across the room, scanning eyes that now darted toward papers. Not people. This doesn't silence the judiciary. He said it simply restores the boundaries voters expected when they cast their ballots. Jaime Racine stood immediately, voice laced with disdain. This bill is not a restoration. It's a retaliation. You're punishing judges for doing their jobs. You're neutering a constitutional branch because it doesn't obey political will. Ayanna Pressley chimed in sharply. You don't want judges to be neutral. You want them to be invisible, silent, while executive overreach rolls over civil rights justice. Jackson remained still, but her eyes had narrowed not in defiance, but in calculation. When she spoke, it was no longer with confidence, but with effort. Every decision I've rendered was grounded in precedent. My intention was never to govern, but to guard. I won't apologize for that. Tom Cotton responded with precision. No one asked you to apologize, Justice, but intention does not erase consequence. And the consequence is this: one unelected official now has the power to cancel national policy before it ever touches the ground. Donald stepped in quietly, folding his notes. And when that happens 11 times in 3 months, it's no longer coincidence, it's structure, it's system. And now it's time for Congress to reassert its role. No one moved. No one spoke after nearly 4 hours of legal warfare. The final moment arrived, not with an outburst, but with something far more decisive. Complete silence, Justice Ketanji Brown. Jackson sat back, her gaze no longer defiant but distant. It's from a TR. Her fingers rested on the edge of the memo, introduced by Donald's not pushing it.